Does anyone remember Morse code? Did you learn Morse code? I see a few people remember it. Morse code was a way of using dots and dashes to represent the alphabet. Some people would remember SOS, dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. And you could use Morse code in a variety of ways. So you could use a flashlight, you could tap on a wall, all different. You could even blink your eyes. There were examples of prisoners of war giving a message using Morse code with blinking their eyes. But probably the most common way, long before there were smartphones and emails, long before even the telephone, the telegraph was the way that you communicated over long distances. And the telegraph used Morse code. And telegraph operators would listen to it and they would communicate using this. So there's a story that's told of a young person who applied for a job as a telegraph operator. So he answered an ad in the newspaper, he went to the office address that was listed, and when he arrived, he came into a large telegraph office, very noisy, very busy office, filled with noise and clatter, and including the sound of the telegraph, of course, in the background. Dot, 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 dash, 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 etc. So there was a sign on the receptionist desk that says, fill out a job application and then sit down and wait until you're called into the office of the supervisor. So the young man filled out a form and he sat down with the other applicants in the waiting area because there were other people who were applying for a job. But after a few minutes, the young man got up, walked into the office and closed the door behind him. Well, naturally, all the other people who had been waiting were a little kind of surprised by this because nobody had called them to come into the other office, and they started kind of muttering amongst themselves. Within a few minutes, the employer, the supervisor, came out and he said to the other applicants, well, thank you all very much for coming, but the job has been filled. And the other applicants kind of started grumbling and complaining to one another. And finally, one spoke up and said, well, wait a minute, I don't understand. He was actually the last one to come in, and we never even got a chance to be interviewed, yet he got the job. That's not fair. And the employer, the supervisor, said, well, I'm sorry, but all the time that you've been sitting there, the telegraph has been ticking out the following message in Morse code. If you understand this message, then come right in. The job is yours. None of you heard it or understood it. He said this young man did, so of course the job is his. Now, all of the applicants presumably knew Morse code, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be there applying for the job. But really only one of them was awake enough, only one of them was aware enough to hear the message being ticked out amidst all the noise and chaos that was going on in the office. Well, I like that story because I have to admit, sometimes I ask myself if I'm like one of those other applicants who didn't get the job. I know I'm in the right place. I'm in the right place today. I think I know all the right stuff. At least I've been told that I learned the right stuff. But am I aware? Am I really listening and hearing the message that God has for me today, that God is sending for me today? And so in this context, I think Advent gives me the opportunity and gives all of us the opportunity to ask that question of ourselves. Are we awake enough to hear, to see the signs that God has for us this Advent season? As you all probably know, the Christian year begins with the season of Advent. And that beginning, I think, itself is significant. We might think logically that the church year would begin perhaps with Easter or Christmas or maybe Pentecost. But instead, we begin in a very different kind of way. We begin in darkness. We begin in the shadows of war, of sorrow, of hatred. And I think we begin there because it is precisely there that our God, the God of grace, will arrive. And so it's precisely there that God's church, all of us, is called to be and to light candles as we will, these candles of hope, of peace, of joy. and of love. So to me, that's a powerful part of what Advent is. Again, probably you all know this, but maybe to review, the season of Advent is called Advent because it comes from a Latin word meaning coming or arrival. And of course, we immediately think of it as the coming or arrival of Jesus at Christmas time, and that is correct, but of course, it's not the whole story, right? We speak of the three comings of the Lord. First, of course, is the coming of the child Jesus in Bethlehem, and we prepare for that in these next 4 weeks. So we might call that the first coming. In the gospel, we heard about the end of the world when Jesus comes again, and we often talk about that as the second coming. But we know also that there is a third coming, which is really an important link between those first and second comings. It is the coming of Jesus into our world and into our lives in the here and now. And this is something which takes place every day. And when we acknowledge that coming of Jesus every day, then I think we're also acknowledging our belief in the incarnation, that first coming of Jesus, and we're preparing ourselves as the Christian community for that second coming of Jesus sometime in the future. I like to use the quote from the poet Paula d'Arcy. I've probably used it before. God comes to us disguised as our very lives. So Christ comes to us today disguised as our very lives, in our homes, in our jobs, in our relationships, in how we care for the earth, in how we use our possessions or dispose of our possessions, and of course right here in the sacred scripture, in one another, the gathered assembly, and in the sacraments. Christ is coming to us in our very lives. Now, in the gospel, Jesus refers to the days of Noah, and that's kind of a shorthand meant to emphasize the importance, as we heard, of staying alert and prepared. If you remember that powerful story of Noah from the Hebrew scripture in Genesis chapter 6, it begins by saying that at the time of Noah, the world was full of violence, filled with violence, and many people were oblivious to it. And God was upset about this and wanted it to be swept away, washed away. Sounds like a familiar time to me with a world full of violence. We've seen that, well, we continue to see it, but it has been powerful for us in these last few weeks with more school shootings in our own neighborhoods, with the terrible tragedy in Colorado, with the killings at the Walmart, et cetera, et cetera. Our world is filled with violence, and it seems that many are oblivious to it. Now, of course, in contrast to that, Noah and his family built an ark. And I think it's worth remembering that the ark wasn't just to save themselves. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to build an ark so we're okay. It was to save all of God's creatures, to save all of God's creation. So I think in this context, staying awake doesn't mean just having one's eyes open, but it means to have one's eyes open and one's hearts open and facing in the right direction. That is, like Noah and his family, being open to service, being open to giving to all of creation, to all of humanity. That is staying awake. That's the staying awake that we're called to be. And the sleep from which we must awaken is, as Pope Francis has said, the sleep of indifference. The sleep of indifference, I think it's a powerful concept. He talks about the inability to care for our brothers and sisters who are alone, who are abandoned, who are ill, who are in any way rejected by the world. And so Pope Francis has said, vigilance also means, in a concrete sense, being attentive to our neighbor in difficulty, allowing oneself to be called upon by his or her needs without waiting for him to ask for help, but learning to foresee, to anticipate, as God always does with us. So I think the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew today should not be read as any kind of a threat or a warning about the end of times, but a challenge for today's times, to live in the present, to engage in life now, to be attentive to the moment at hand. And that is the call of Advent itself, to be watchful and alert and awake, and not be like the applicants there, who the message was there. They knew everything they needed to know to hear the message, but they were distracted with other things and did not hear the actual message they were being called to. So in this Advent season, I would try myself and call on all of us to be alert, to be awake, and that we not put off opening our lives to the message of God that God has for us this Advent.